It was a quiet evening in a small neighborhood on the edge of the city. The streets were calm and the sky was turning a soft orange as the sun went down. Families were finishing dinner, kids were playing on the sidewalks, and the sound of traffic was distant and steady. In one corner of the street, an old gas station buzzed with the hum of flickering lights. It was the kind of place people stopped at for a quick snack or a late-night refill before heading home. A young woman pulled into the station, her car slowing to a stop by the pump. She moved carefully, every step thoughtful and slow. Her belly showed she was expecting a child soon, and she carried herself with the gentle caution of someone protecting more than one life. She wasn't in a rush. She just needed a few things before heading home to rest. Her day had already been long enough, and she looked forward to getting off her feet. She went inside the small store, picked up a few snacks, and came back out, humming softly. A faint smile appeared on her face as she unlocked her car door. The world around her felt peaceful for a brief moment, until flashing blue lights broke that calm. A police cruiser pulled into the lot, stopping a few feet away. The officer inside seemed tense, eyes sharp, moving quickly as if something urgent had brought him there. He had received a call earlier about a suspected stolen vehicle matching the description of the woman's car. The report wasn't confirmed, but he had chosen to check it out right away. The kind of call that happens often, simple misunderstandings that are usually cleared up in minutes. But from the moment he stepped out, the air felt different. There was a wave of confusion that neither of them quite understood. The woman, seeing the lights, froze for a second. She wasn't sure what she had done wrong. She looked around, maybe thinking the officer was after someone else. But the car's headlights reflected in her eyes, and the sound of the officer's voice calling out to her pulled her attention. He asked her to step away from the car. His tone wasn't angry, but it was sharp enough to make her nervous. She tried to explain that the car was hers, that there must be a mistake. Her voice trembled a little, not from guilt but from uncertainty. She didn't want any trouble. Her hands were visible, and her words were calm, though her heart was racing. Other people in the area started to notice. A man across the street, standing by his porch, paused and looked over. A woman walking her dog stopped too. There was something about the tension in the air that made people uneasy. The flashing lights bounced off the nearby windows, turning the quiet corner into a stage that no one had expected. The officer moved closer, his hand resting near his side, the kind of habit that comes from training and instinct. He asked for her identification again, and she tried to reach into her purse slowly. She kept her voice steady, explaining each move, trying to show she meant no harm. But something in that moment, maybe the movement, maybe the misunderstanding, made everything spiral faster than it should have. He called out again, louder this time. She froze, startled. The voices overlapped and words got lost in panic. The people watching from afar couldn't make out what was said, but they could feel the fear building between them. It was like watching two people standing at the edge of a cliff, neither knowing how they got there, and then a sudden sound broke through the noise, a single sharp noise that echoed down the block. It wasn't described clearly by those who heard it. It was fast and confusing. The woman gasped and stumbled, the shock spreading across her face. The officer's expression changed instantly. His training told him to act, but his heart froze in disbelief. Everything that happened next felt like a blur. People started shouting. Someone pulled out a phone, recording. Others yelled for help. The officer rushed forward, calling for medical support. He was saying something. Apologies, panic, instructions, no one could tell. The woman was still conscious, but her breathing was uneven. She was scared, whispering words no one could clearly hear. It all happened in seconds, but it felt like hours to everyone there. The officer's hands trembled as he tried to help, his voice breaking as he spoke into his radio. The weight of what had just happened hit him like a wave. He hadn't meant for this. No one could have prepared for this. His heart was racing as he tried to keep her awake, his mind spinning in disbelief. When the ambulance arrived, the lights painted the entire street in red and blue. Neighbors stood on their porches, silent, as paramedics worked quickly. The woman was lifted carefully, her hand still resting over her stomach. The medics moved fast, knowing every second mattered. The officer stepped back, his face pale, watching as she was taken away. He didn't move. He couldn't. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked tirelessly. The woman's eyes flickered, half open, her breaths shallow. She kept whispering something softly. A name, perhaps, or a prayer. No one could quite make it out, but the sound was enough to break the silence. The city around them kept moving, unaware of what had just unfolded at a small gas station on a quiet street. At the police station later, the officer sat in a room alone, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The world outside was spinning fast, news spreading, questions rising, people demanding answers. But inside, time seemed frozen. He could still see her face, still hear the sound that changed everything. Every word, every second replayed in his mind like a loop he couldn't escape. He kept asking himself the same question. How did it go so wrong? He had done hundreds of stops before. He had been careful, calm, professional. But tonight something had gone terribly off script. A small misunderstanding had turned into a life-changing moment. For her, for him, and for everyone who would hear about it. Outside, the first reports were already spreading. A crowd had gathered at the scene, sharing stories, videos, and shock. Some defended the officer, saying he looked frightened. Others were furious, asking why such a mistake could happen. It wasn't just about one person anymore. It was about a feeling that had been building for years, about trust, fear, and how fragile the space between the two could be. At the hospital, doctors worked through the night. Machines beeped, nurses moved quickly, and her loved ones waited in silent prayer. The waiting room was filled with quiet tears and whispered questions. The woman had always been careful, always gentle, always smiling even through hard days. And now, as she lay still under the soft glow of hospital lights, everyone around her hoped she would open her eyes again. Back at the gas station, all that remained was the reflection of flashing lights on the pavement. The night had turned cold, and the world seemed heavier. What started as an ordinary evening had turned into something that would be remembered far beyond that small corner of the city. A single moment of confusion had changed countless lives. And somewhere, deep down, the officer knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The night after the incident was long and restless for everyone involved. The small town that had once been quiet was now filled with whispers, news alerts, and confusion. People were talking, posting, calling one another. The gas station where it all happened had become a place everyone suddenly recognized. Reporters stood outside with cameras while strangers left flowers by the curb. At the hospital, machines hummed softly in a dimly lit room. The young woman lay still, her body surrounded by gentle sounds, heart monitors, the soft steps of nurses, and the quiet breathing of her loved ones who refused to leave her side. Her mother sat in a chair beside her bed, holding her hand tightly. Every so often she would whisper something as if her daughter could still hear her. The doctors had said she was in a deep sleep, her body trying to heal. The baby was still, safe for the moment, and that was the only piece of good news anyone could hold on to. Her family clung to that hope like it was the only thing keeping them from falling apart. They had faith that one day she would wake up, open her eyes, and tell them it was all just a bad dream. Back at the police station, the officer sat in a small room for hours. The lights above him were bright, but everything still felt dark. His uniform was neatly folded on the table beside him, and his badge lay face down. He kept staring at it, wondering what it even meant now. His supervisor had told him to go home and rest, but he couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, the fear in her eyes, the confusion in her voice. He wished more than anything that he could go back a few seconds and do something different, anything to change what happened. The department had started its official review. Papers were being filed, statements were being taken, and people from the city office had arrived to handle public questions. The chief of police gave a short statement on television that morning. His words were careful, calm, and professional, but anyone watching could see the tension behind his eyes. He promised a full investigation and asked the public not to rush to judgment until all facts were clear. But out in the world, people were already forming opinions. Some defended the officer, saying he must have been scared and that it was an accident. Others were angry, saying this was another example of how easily things went wrong for people who looked like her. The internet was full of voices, some compassionate, some cruel. Videos from witnesses had been posted online, and each clip brought new arguments, new emotions. The officer's family tried to comfort him, but there were no words that could take away the weight he felt. He didn't want to eat or sleep. He kept replaying everything in his mind, what he said, what she said, how fast it all happened. He knew the world saw him as one thing now, but inside he just felt broken. He didn't see himself as a monster or a hero, just a man who made a terrible mistake that he could never undo. Meanwhile, the woman's family had gathered their strength. Her brother spoke to the reporters outside the hospital. His voice shook, but his message was clear. They didn't want anger or chaos, they just wanted truth and accountability. He said his sister had always believed in fairness and peace, and they wanted to honor her that way. The community began to organize small vigils, people holding candles, praying quietly, and leaving notes of love. In the following days, things began to move quickly. The news spread beyond the small town, reaching national attention. Talk shows, podcasts, and community leaders began discussing the situation. Some people saw it as part of a bigger issue, while others saw it as a tragedy that shouldn't be politicized. But no matter what side people stood on, one thing was true. Everyone felt something. Anger, sadness, fear, confusion. The hospital became a second home for her family. Her mother refused to leave, sleeping in the chair by her bedside. The nurses treated her gently, knowing how much she had been through. Sometimes at night her mother would talk to the unborn child, telling it stories, singing softly, and promising that everything would be okay. The sound of her voice filled the quiet room with warmth even when hope felt far away. One day the officer decided to visit the hospital. It wasn't part of procedure, and his supervisors had told him not to, but he couldn't stop thinking about her. He stood outside the hospital doors for a long time before going in. His steps were slow, uncertain. When he reached her room, he stopped. He saw her through the glass window, still peaceful, surrounded by machines and flowers. He didn't go inside. He couldn't. His chest tightened and his eyes watered. He whispered something under his breath, a quiet apology no one else could hear, and then turned away. The community started gathering signatures for justice. People wrote letters to local officials, asking for change, asking for training, asking for something to make sure no one else went through this again. The local church opened its doors for anyone who wanted to talk or pray. There were tears, but there was also unity. People who didn't even know each other before were now standing side by side. Days turned into weeks. The woman's condition stayed the same, and the officer's life stayed on pause. He was under review, waiting to see what the department would decide. Each day he checked the news, watching people talk about him, guessing his thoughts, questioning his actions. Some painted him as a villain. Others said he was a man who made a split-second mistake. But none of them knew how heavy that night had become for him. He started keeping a small notebook. In it, he wrote everything he remembered, every detail, every sound, every feeling. It was his way of facing what happened, even though it hurt. Some nights he wrote letters he'd never send, trying to say what he couldn't say out loud. "I didn't mean to hurt you," one of them said. "I was scared. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was wrong. I'll carry this forever." At the same time, her family continued to hope. Every small movement, every flicker on a monitor felt like a sign. The doctors told them not to get ahead of themselves, but faith has a way of ignoring statistics. They prayed every morning and every night. Friends brought food and sat quietly in the waiting area. There were no loud conversations, just silence filled with love and worry. Reporters eventually moved on to news stories, but for the people involved, life didn't move on at all. The town still carried the memory of that night. The gas station remained open, though fewer people stopped there now. The owner placed a small candle near the spot where everything happened, lighting it each evening before closing. Inside the police department, a change began. Officers were asked to attend new training sessions focused on calm communication, awareness, and empathy. The chief admitted to the community that mistakes had been made and promised to rebuild trust. It wasn't easy, and not everyone believed his words, but it was a start. One afternoon, weeks after the incident, something finally shifted. A nurse walked into the hospital room and noticed her fingers moving slightly. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was real. She called for the doctor, and within minutes the room was full of quiet excitement. Her mother cried softly, holding her hand again, whispering her name over and over. The doctor said it was too early to tell what it meant, but it was hope. Real, living hope. For the first time in weeks, the air in the room didn't feel heavy. It felt alive. Outside, the sky was soft again, just like the evening it all began. The same streetlights glowed. The same hum of traffic echoed in the distance. The city didn't know yet that something inside that hospital room had changed, but it would soon. And somewhere across town, the officer sat at his desk, staring at the same notebook he wrote in every night. He didn't know that she had moved her hand. He didn't know that hope had returned. But for the first time in a long while, he looked up from his pages and whispered, "Please wake up." He didn't know why he said it, or if anyone could even hear him. But in that small, quiet moment, it felt like the whole world was waiting for the same thing, waiting for her to open her eyes and remind everyone that even in the middle of mistakes, sorrow and fear, life still has the power to rise again. The first small movement in her hand changed everything. It wasn't a miracle all at once, but it was enough to make everyone around her believe that something good was finally happening. The nurses checked her monitors twice. The doctor smiled softly, and her mother cried tears she had been holding back for weeks. Hope, which had felt so far away, had found its way back into the hospital room. Each day after that, her body showed more signs of life. A finger twitched, an eye moved slightly, and her breathing grew stronger. Her family stayed close, talking to her every day, even if she didn't respond. They told her stories about home, about the baby, about how much everyone missed her voice. They believed that somewhere deep inside she could hear them. The doctor said recovery would take time. Her body was weak, her mind still in a fragile state, but she was fighting. Slowly her eyes began to open, not fully, just enough for a flicker of light to reach her. The first time her mother saw her eyes move, she froze. Then she reached out and whispered, "We're here. You're safe." It was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Outside the hospital, the story had quieted in the news, but people hadn't forgotten. The community still prayed for her, still spoke her name at gatherings, still hoped for justice. Some believed she would wake up and tell her story one day. Others simply wanted her to live in peace, away from the noise and the cameras. When she finally opened her eyes completely, the world around her looked blurry and strange. The lights were bright, the machines beeped steadily, and she could barely move her hands. Her throat was dry and her voice came out soft when she tried to speak. The nurse leaned closer, smiling warmly, and told her not to rush. "You're okay," she said gently. "You're safe now." Her mother came into the room a few moments later. The look on her face was one of relief, love, and exhaustion all mixed together. She held her daughter's hand, repeating softly, "You came back. You really came back." The woman didn't understand everything yet, why she was there, what had happened, how long it had been, but she could feel the love around her, and that was enough for now. Days passed and her strength slowly returned. She started physical therapy to help her move again, and the hospital staff treated her with extra care. Every step was small but meaningful. When she first stood up with help, her mother clapped quietly, tears running down her face. Even the nurses smiled. Everyone in that ward knew her story by now, and her recovery felt like a victory for them too. At the same time, the officer who had been involved in the incident was living through his own kind of recovery. His suspension was still in place while the investigation continued, and he spent most of his days alone in his apartment. The walls felt like they were closing in on him sometimes. He barely spoke to anyone except his lawyer and his family, who checked on him daily. He had heard from a fellow officer that the woman was alive and that she had woken up. The moment he heard that, something inside him broke and healed at the same time. He sat in silence for a long while, his eyes fixed on the floor. He whispered, "Thank you," even though he didn't know who he was thanking, her, fate, or the universe. He knew that her survival didn't erase what happened, but it meant there was still a chance for some kind of forgiveness. He didn't expect it, but he hoped one day she might hear him out, not to justify what happened, but to show her that he carried the weight of that night every single day. Meanwhile, the woman's recovery became a symbol of strength. People in her community started calling her the fighter. Her story inspired others who were facing their own battles. The hospital received letters from strangers across the country sending love and prayers. Her family read some of them to her every evening, reminding her how many people cared about her even though they had never met. As her strength returned, so did her memories. At first, everything was foggy. She remembered driving that night, the gas station, the lights, but then her mind would go blank. The doctor said it was normal. Sometimes the mind protects itself from painful memories. They told her to focus on healing, not on forcing herself to remember. But deep down she wanted to know. She wanted to understand what had happened to her and why. Weeks later, she was able to walk short distances with help. Her body was still weak, but her will was strong. She asked for updates about the investigation, but her family tried to protect her from the details, afraid it might upset her. She appreciated their care, but she also felt a quiet anger building inside. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that asks questions and seeks truth. The officer had written several letters by that time. He never sent them, but he kept them neatly folded in a drawer. In one of them he wrote, "If I could take your pain away, I would. I made a mistake that changed your life and mine too. I can't ask you to forgive me, but I need you to know that I've learned what it means to see someone as more than a situation, more than a report. I see you as a person, and I'm sorry." The police department eventually held a community meeting. The chief stood before a crowded room filled with residents, reporters, and city officials. He admitted that the situation had been handled poorly, and he promised to improve communication, training, and transparency. The crowd was quiet, listening but skeptical. Words were easy. Action was what they wanted to see. During the same period, the woman's story was featured in a local newspaper. The article focused on her recovery, how she was learning to walk again, how she smiled even through the pain, and how her unborn child was growing healthy. It didn't focus on anger. It focused on resilience. People who read it felt something shift inside them. For a moment, the story wasn't about division or blame. It was about strength and hope. As the weeks turned into months, her body healed, but her heart still carried questions. One afternoon, her doctor asked if she wanted to speak to a counselor. She agreed. The sessions helped her process what happened without reliving it in detail. She talked about fear, forgiveness, and the uncertainty of what came next. Slowly, she began to rebuild her trust in the world around her. The officer also began attending counseling sessions arranged by the department. It was mandatory, but it soon became something he needed. He talked about guilt, about fear, about how one moment could define an entire life. The counselor told him that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to live with the truth and trying to become better because of it. Months later, an opportunity came for them to meet face to face. It wasn't easy for either of them. The hospital had arranged it carefully, ensuring it would be a safe and private conversation. She was nervous, unsure of what to say, while he was terrified that his presence might hurt her more, but they both knew it was something that needed to happen. When they met, the room was silent at first. He couldn't look her in the eye at first. His hands trembled slightly. She studied him quietly, noticing how tired he looked, how much the incident had aged him in just a few months. He began to speak, his voice soft and heavy. He told her he was sorry, that he wished he could change everything, that he carried her face in his mind every day since that night. She listened without interrupting. Her eyes filled with tears, not of anger but of understanding. When he finished, she didn't say much. She simply said, "You took something from me that I can never get back. But I'm still here. My baby is still here, and maybe that's what I have to hold on to." He nodded, unable to speak. They sat there in silence for a moment, not as officer and victim, but as two human beings who had both been broken by the same night. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of peace. After that meeting, both of them walked away different. She continued her healing journey with a new sense of strength. He returned to his small apartment, closed the door, and cried for the first time in months. It wasn't from guilt this time. It was from relief that she was alive, that she had found a way to rise above the pain. Her story began to spread again, but now it was told differently. It wasn't about the mistake or the fear. It was about resilience, humanity, and the power of choosing to live after everything had gone wrong. People began to see her not just as a survivor, but as a symbol of what healing could look like. And though the road ahead was still long, she knew one thing for sure. She would not let that night define her future. She had a life to live, a child to raise, and a world to remind that even in the darkest moments, compassion could still win. Months had passed since the woman had met the officer face to face. Time had moved forward, yet for both of them, life still felt divided, before and after that night. The world outside continued on its own rhythm. Seasons changed, leaves turned color, and people returned to their routines. But for them, every new day was a reminder of how fragile and precious life could be. At the hospital, the woman's recovery became steady. She could now walk on her own, though she still moved carefully. The doctor said her progress was remarkable, and the baby was growing strong and healthy. Every heartbeat she heard during checkups felt like a small miracle. She smiled more now, not because everything was okay, but because she had learned how to live again after being so close to losing everything. Her family had been her greatest strength. Her mother's patience, her brother's quiet support, her friends' late-night visits, all of it helped her rebuild herself piece by piece. There were hard days, too. Sometimes she woke up in tears, unsure why. Other times, loud noises made her flinch or lose her breath for a moment. The doctors called it a normal reaction after trauma, but to her it was more than that. It was a reminder that healing was not a straight road. It curved, paused, and sometimes went backward before moving forward again. She began journaling every evening. She wrote about what she felt, what she feared, and what she hoped for. Her handwriting was slow and shaky at first, but the more she wrote, the steadier her letters became. Some days her entries were only a few words like, "I'm grateful for today," or "still here." On other days, she filled entire pages with reflections about faith, forgiveness, and what it means to survive something that changes your view of the world. One afternoon, she decided to step outside alone for the first time. The hospital garden was quiet, filled with small flowers and the sound of birds. She sat on a bench, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath of fresh air. For weeks she had seen life through windows. Now she could finally feel the sun again. It was a simple thing, but to her it felt like freedom. In that same town, the officer's days looked very different. His suspension had turned into reassignment while the case remained open. He worked at the training division now, away from the streets, teaching new recruits about communication and safety. The department believed it was a way for him to contribute while also learning from his mistake. At first, he wasn't sure he deserved to teach anyone, but over time, he realized that maybe sharing what he had learned could prevent someone else from repeating his error. He didn't wear the same confident smile he once had. His voice was softer now, his words more careful. When he spoke to the recruits, he often told them, "Every person you meet has a story. Don't let your fear speak louder than your humanity." The younger officers listened closely. They could tell his advice came from experience, not from a textbook. Outside of work, he tried to live quietly. He stayed away from the media and the noise of public opinion. Instead, he focused on volunteering with community programs that built connections between officers and residents. The first time he walked into one of those meetings, he could feel the tension in the air. Some people recognized him and didn't want to talk, but he didn't blame them. He simply showed up week after week until people began to see that he wasn't there for attention. He was there to listen and learn. One evening, he stood at a community center, helping organize food boxes for families. Across the room, a little boy asked him shyly if he was the police guy from the news. The officer hesitated for a second, then knelt down and said softly, "Yes, that was me, but I'm also someone who's trying to do better now." The boy nodded and handed him a box of canned food. That small moment meant more to him than any official apology or statement could. Meanwhile, the woman's life slowly returned to something that looked like normal. She was discharged from the hospital and moved back home with her family's help. The first night back, she lay in her own bed staring at the ceiling, grateful and afraid all at once. The familiar walls brought comfort, but also memories she couldn't quite shake. She whispered a small prayer, thanking the universe for another chance and asking for strength to face the world outside her door. Her neighbors welcomed her with flowers and gentle smiles. They didn't ask questions. They just offered love. The community that had once been filled with tension now seemed to breathe easier knowing she had survived. People saw her as a living symbol of hope, though she didn't see herself that way. She just wanted to live quietly, raise her child, and rebuild her peace. She began attending a support group for people who had gone through life-changing events. The group met once a week in a small hall at the edge of town. Each person shared their story, their pain, and their progress. Listening to others reminded her that she wasn't alone. Her turn to speak came after a few sessions, and when she finally did, her voice trembled. She talked about fear, about waking up in a world that felt unfamiliar, and about learning to breathe again without panic. The group listened in silence, and when she finished, they applauded softly, not because her story was dramatic, but because it was real. At home, she decorated a small corner for the baby, soft blankets, a tiny crib, a stuffed animal that her mother had kept from her own childhood. Every morning she would sit there, resting her hand on her belly, imagining what kind of world her child would grow up in. She promised herself she would raise this child to know kindness, strength, and compassion, no matter how imperfect the world could be. The officer heard about her progress through quiet updates from colleagues and local news. He didn't reach out again after their meeting, respecting her space. But knowing that she was healing gave him strength to keep working on himself. He started attending town meetings where people discussed police reform. Instead of defending himself or his department, he sat in the back and listened. Every story he heard, every voice of frustration, pain, or mistrust added another layer of understanding to his heart. In time, some people began to notice the change in him. An older community leader approached him after one of those meetings and said, "You can't change the past, but you can help build a better tomorrow. Keep showing up." Those words stayed with him. As her due date approached, the woman felt both excitement and fear. She had gone through so much already that every heartbeat of her baby felt like a miracle. The day she finally went into labor, her family surrounded her with love and encouragement. Hours later, she held her child for the first time, a tiny breathing reminder that life could still bloom out of pain. Her tears were soft and full of gratitude. She whispered to the baby, "You're my reason to keep going." News of her baby's birth spread quickly through the town. People celebrated quietly, as if a heavy shadow had finally lifted. Even the officer heard about it and smiled for the first time in weeks. He didn't say anything to anyone, but he looked up at the sky that night and whispered, "I'm glad they're both okay." The woman spent the following weeks adjusting to motherhood. Sleepless nights, gentle lullabies, and the quiet joy of watching her baby's first smiles became her new rhythm. She wasn't the same person she was before, and she knew it. She was stronger, wiser, and more aware of the world. Sometimes, when she looked out her window at night, she thought about forgiveness not as a gift for someone else, but as something she needed to free her own heart. She didn't know yet if she could ever truly forgive the officer, but she knew she didn't want to live in anger forever. She wanted to raise her child in peace, not fear. And maybe that was the beginning of forgiveness itself. Not forgetting, but choosing to live beyond the hurt. In the following months, the town began to change in small ways. The police department started community workshops where officers and residents could share stories and learn from one another. The officer continued to teach, focusing on empathy and patience. The woman joined one of those workshops later, not as a victim, but as a voice for healing. When she walked into the room, people fell silent. She spoke softly about what happened, how she survived, and how important it was to see each other as human beings before anything else. When she finished speaking, the room was quiet. Even the officer, who stood in the back, couldn't hold back his tears. He didn't approach her afterward, but their eyes met briefly, and that small exchange said more than words ever could. That night, when she went home, she felt something shift inside her, a quiet peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe forgiveness wasn't about forgetting. Maybe it was about letting go just enough to move forward. And as her baby slept beside her, she smiled softly. The world was still imperfect, still unpredictable, but it was also full of chances to start over. She had been through darkness and found her way back to light. And she knew that as long as she kept choosing compassion over bitterness, her child would grow up in a world that had at least a little more hope in it. Years had passed since that night that changed everything. The seasons had come and gone, and life, in its quiet way, had continued to move forward. The woman's child was now a little boy who loved to laugh, run through the park, and chase butterflies. His smile carried a kind of light that touched everyone who saw it. To his mother, that smile was proof that beauty could rise even from pain. Their home was small but full of warmth. The walls were decorated with family pictures, and the sound of laughter often filled the rooms. She had gone back to school studying social work, wanting to help others who had faced trauma. Her days were busy, caring for her child, studying and volunteering, but they were full of meaning. Every morning when she woke up, she felt thankful to have another chance to live, to love, and to make a difference. Sometimes, though, the memories still returned. A sound, a flash of light, or even the echo of a siren could make her heart race for a moment, but she had learned to breathe through it, to remind herself that she was safe now. The fear no longer controlled her. It simply reminded her how strong she had become. Her mother often said, "You turned your pain into purpose." And maybe that was true. She didn't want to live as a symbol of tragedy. She wanted to live as proof that healing was possible. She started speaking at local events about resilience and forgiveness. People listened, not because her story was dramatic, but because it was real. She didn't speak with bitterness. Instead, she spoke with calm honesty, with a voice that carried both sorrow and strength. At one of those events, she saw the officer again. It had been years since their last meeting, but she recognized him immediately. His hair was grayer now, his face older, but his eyes still carried that same quiet regret. He waited until the end of the event before approaching her. His steps were careful, respectful, almost hesitant. When he finally stood before her, there was silence for a moment. "I just wanted to thank you," he said softly, "for speaking, for doing what you do. You don't know how many people you've helped, me included." She nodded slowly. "I've been trying to move forward," she said. "Not forget. Just move forward," he smiled sadly. "That's all any of us can do." They stood there for a moment, two people bound by a past they couldn't change but no longer trapped by it. There were no long speeches, no grand apologies, just a shared understanding that time had softened the edges of pain and turned it into something gentler, something that could breathe again. The officer had changed, too. After years of reflection, he had chosen to leave the police force. He now worked with community organizations, teaching conflict resolution and emotional awareness to officers around the country. His workshops focused on humanity, on listening before reacting, on compassion before judgment. People who once doubted his sincerity began to see that his change was real, not born from guilt alone, but from genuine growth. He often spoke to new recruits, reminding them that every decision carries weight. Behind every uniform and every citizen, he would say, there are human beings, and when we forget that, we lose ourselves. He never mentioned his past directly, but everyone who knew his story could feel the truth in his words. Back in town, the woman's days were full. Her child had started school, curious about everything, full of questions she could barely keep up with. Sometimes when he asked where his father was or why people seemed to know his mother's name, she would smile gently and say, "It's a long story. I'll tell you when you're older." She didn't want him to grow up with fear or anger. She wanted him to see the world as a place that could still be kind, even when it wasn't perfect. One afternoon, she took her son to the same park where she used to sit during her recovery. The trees had grown taller and the benches were freshly painted. As they walked, she saw familiar faces, neighbors, friends, people who had been there during her hardest times. They greeted her with warmth, with respect. She had become part of the heartbeat of that town, a quiet reminder that even broken things can heal beautifully. Her son ran ahead, chasing a kite that another child had let go. She laughed as he tripped on the grass, got up, and kept running. Watching him, she thought about everything she had been through, the hospital, the fear, the long nights of tears, and she realized how far she had come. She had once been afraid to step outside, afraid of the world. Now, she was standing in the sunlight, watching her child grow up free. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she sat on her porch, holding a cup of tea. Her mother joined her, sitting quietly beside her. They didn't need to talk much anymore. Their silence was full of understanding. After a while, her mother said, "You've built a beautiful life." She smiled. "It's not perfect, but it's ours. And that's enough." Across town, the officer sat at his desk, finishing a long day of teaching. He looked at the framed picture on his desk, a quote that said, "Growth begins where comfort ends." It was something he had learned the hard way. He often thought about how one moment of fear had changed two lives forever. But he also knew that from that pain, something meaningful had grown. A reminder that people are capable of change, of learning, of becoming better. He didn't try to erase his past. He carried it with him not as shame but as a lesson. And though he never expected forgiveness, knowing that the woman had found peace allowed him to live with a lighter heart. Some nights he still replayed that evening in his mind, not out of torment anymore, but as a reminder of what it meant to be human, fragile, and imperfect. Years later, the town honored the woman at a community event celebrating resilience. She didn't want attention, but she accepted the invitation because she knew the message mattered. On stage, she held her child's hand and spoke softly into the microphone. "I used to think healing meant going back to who I was before," she said. "But I've learned that healing means becoming someone new, someone stronger, wiser, and more compassionate. We can't change what's behind us, but we can choose what we carry forward." The crowd applauded, many with tears in their eyes. Even from the back of the room, the officer watched, proud and humbled. He didn't approach her this time. He just smiled and clapped with everyone else, knowing that the best apology was to live differently. After the event, she went home and put her son to bed. As she turned off the light, he looked up and asked, "Mom, why do people call you brave?" She thought for a moment before answering. "Because sometimes being brave just means choosing kindness when you could choose anger. It means standing up when life tries to push you down." He nodded sleepily, holding her hand until he drifted off. She stayed beside him for a while, listening to his soft breathing, feeling grateful. Then she walked to the window, looked out at the night sky and whispered a quiet thank you. To life, to time, to everything that had carried her this far. The world outside was peaceful again. The same gas station where it all began had been rebuilt, brighter and safer. People came and went without knowing the story that once took place there. For most, it was just another stop on their way home. But for her, it would always be a reminder, a place where her life had nearly ended and where her second chance began. The next morning, she woke up early, as she always did. She packed her son's lunch, tied his shoes, and kissed his forehead before walking him to school. The air was cool, the streets quiet. As they crossed the same intersection where flashing lights once filled the night, she looked up at the sky and smiled. There were no ghosts there anymore, just memories and peace. Her son ran ahead, waving goodbye before disappearing through the school gates. She stood there for a moment watching him and felt a deep calm settle in her heart. She had survived the storm, faced her fears, and found meaning in the ashes of chaos. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a teacher, a mother, a voice for compassion. As she turned to walk back home, she passed a mural painted on a brick wall near the community center. It showed two hands reaching toward each other, one in uniform, one unarmed, with the words, "We are all human." She paused and smiled, knowing what those words meant, not just to her but to everyone who had learned from her story. The world hadn't become perfect. Mistakes still happened, people still hurt, and change was still slow. But hearts had opened, lessons had been learned, and bridges had been built where once there had been walls. And sometimes, that's enough. The woman walked home under the soft morning sun, her steps steady, her spirit calm. She carried no anger, only lessons. Her past would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She was living proof that even when the world breaks you, you can rise again, not untouched, but stronger, kinder, and more human than before. And as she reached her door, her phone buzzed, a message from the community center asking if she could speak again next week. She smiled, typed back yes, and whispered to herself, "Let's keep going," because life, no matter how heavy, always finds a way forward.